Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Katie Flaherty, the project coordinator for Future of California Elections. We have had a great program and we are now nearing the end. Our final panel discussion will review the question, how do we ensure language access in elections through a COVID-19 response? This panel is moderated by Jonathan Stein, the new Executive Director of California Common Cause. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading this discussion, and I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you to Astrid and everyone else who worked to make today's virtual conference such a success. I'm Jonathan Stein, the new Executive Director at California Common Cause, and we're here today to talk about language access. So I want to start with a statistic. California has 2.7 million eligible voters who self-identify as limited English proficient on the census, just in the Asian American and Latino communities. That means we have more limited English proficient voters than other states have voters, period. California is truly unique in this respect. In order to build a representative democracy, California has to build the nation's first multilingual democracy. Reaching everyone, including our limited English-speaking voters, is harder than ever because we're in a COVID environment. So this panel will talk about language access and all of the different challenges that are part of ensuring language access in the November 2020 election. I'm joined by three fabulous panelists. Fabulous panelist number one is Rosalind Gold. She serves as Chief Public Policy Officer with the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund. She's also the chair of the FOS Board of Advisors. Fabulous panelist number two is Julia Marks. She's a staff attorney with the Voting Rights and Census Program at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And fabulous panelist number three is Erin Mendez, an elections outreach coordinator at the Contra Costa County Elections Office. So I just want to make sure that everyone listening today is familiar with the law around language access. So I'll spend just a few minutes covering what language assistance is mandated by federal law and by state law, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists for comments. Section 203 of the Federal Voting Rights Act is the gold standard for language access. It provides a very high level of language assistance for larger language communities. So who receives assistance under Section 203? If an LEP means limited English proficient, it's a term we'll use a lot today, I suspect. If the LEP citizens of voting age in a single language community are either 10,000 in a county or are 5% of the citizens of voting age of that county, then everything in that county has to be translated into the language spoken by that language community. That means ballots, vote-by-mail ballots, provisional ballots, voter registration materials, content on the county elections website, everything. By contrast, California state law provides a lighter form of language assistance to smaller language communities. Under Section 14201 and other provisions of the California Elections Code, if the LEP residents of voting age in a single language community are 3% of a precinct, not a county, it's measuring at the precinct level, not the county level, as under federal law, the polling place that serves that precinct needs to have translated reference ballots, called facsimile ballots, translated signage, and other services. Elections officials also must make, quote, reasonable efforts, end quote, to recruit bilingual poll workers that work in that polling place. That means if a smaller language community that is in just one neighborhood, they can get language assistance under state law, but just in that neighborhood, not countywide. So to recap, larger language communities meet the size thresholds under the federal law and thus receive everything translated and are more likely to receive bilingual poll workers. Smaller language communities often trigger the requirements of state law and receive a lighter form of language assistance. So while translated voting information is available online and translated vote-by-mail ballots are available to voters, so much of language assistance available to voters is made available in the polling place. So how do we ensure that language assistance is still available in an environment, in an election in which millions of polling place voters are likely moving for the very first time to a vote-by-mail environment? So we'll tackle that question and more through our panelists. I will hand it first over to Rosalind Gold, our first panelist, for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I also want to thank Astrid and all of the folks who helped to make this conference a reality, as well as thank you all of the attendees for joining us. Before I make my opening remarks about our work at the NALEO Educational Fund, I did want to sort of take a chair's privilege to make sure that certain people, that I highlight their efforts in working on this conference. So first of all, I'd like to thank my fellow members of the Future of California Elections Board of Advisors. That includes Kathy Darling Allen, Shasta County Clerk, Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California, and Emily Rush from CalPIRG. And just as importantly, I want to do a shout out to the staff of the Future of California Elections, Katie Flaherty, Guadalupe Flores, and again, as many of you know, our Executive Director, Astrid Ochoa. So thank you all so much. Now, back to language access. At the NALEO Educational Fund, our mission is to facilitate full Latino participation in the political process. And so, of course, making sure that Latino citizens can participate in our elections, no matter where their English language proficiency is critical for our mission. You know, Jonathan gave some figures for the LEP community in California. With respect to Latinos, nearly 1 out of 5 Latinos who are eligible to vote in California do not yet speak English fluently. And as we know, voting materials in California are particularly daunting and challenging, whether it's the length of our ballots, whether it's the complexity of our voter guides. So this language access is very critical. And our organization has continually both promoted policies to further language access, but also we are always delighted to work closely with election officials, who I also want to thank for all your work during this, the crises and the challenges we're facing. And we want to continue to work with election officials on best practices for language access. It really is something we have to do together. And again, we are even more so as we're facing a very different world with the pandemic. So thank you all again.
Up next, I'll hand it over to Julia Marks.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. My name is Julia Marks. I'm an attorney at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, as Jonathan mentioned. First, I'd like to reiterate the thank yous provided by Rosalind. I'm really happy and honored to be here with all these excellent panelists and have already learned a lot today. Just for some background, our team works to protect the voting rights of API and immigrant communities and to promote a more inclusive democratic process. So that means being counted in the census, that means participating in voting, and that also means having a voice in redistricting. Over the last few elections, our program has run a large poll monitoring operation, and we've engaged in a lot of community education work around voting and the VCA. In the course of that work, we've seen some great efforts by counties to reach limited English proficient voters, but it's a big task. And we have also seen instances where voters are not getting the ballots they need in the languages they need, or they can't access the in-person assistance that they need to vote. So as we're looking forward to the November election, we do want to be sure that limited English proficient voters who already often have difficulty accessing elections do have their needs met. We recognize that this will be an enormous undertaking and that ensuring language access, in addition to all types of voting access, is particularly difficult in these times. A couple of our key areas of concern, which we'll get into more detail on later, are that voters understand how they can participate in that November election, and that this includes LEP voters. So the education and outreach is happening in language. We also want to be sure that voters who need translated ballots receive those ballots. And then we want to be sure that voters who need in-person assistance have a place to go to get their help and to vote in person if that's what they need. And we do similarly look forward to collaborating with other community-based organizations and elections officials to make sure that Asian Americans, immigrant communities, and other limited English-speaking voters have full and equal access to the process.
Thanks, Julia. I will now hand it over to Erin Mendez.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin Mendez, and I'm the Elections Outreach Coordinator in Contra Costa County. And I'm very honored and happy to be part of this conference once again and part of this panel. And when I was preparing for this, I couldn't help but thinking of how timely and accurate just, the future of California elections, what we're up against, what we have opportunities for. And this conference is a great platform for us as election officials, as well as for the advocates and all the organizations working hard, to make sure that every voter has access to the information. And specifically speaking to the limited language proficiency, English proficiency voters, we want to make sure that those services are in place. And from the standpoint of an election official, we do have an organization, a statewide organization, is the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials. We have various committees and subcommittees working on different aspects of the elections administration, and one of them has to do with voters with specific needs. And I am a co-chair along with my colleague Tim McNamara from Los Angeles on that subcommittee, and we address the issues with specific needs that people have, whether it's an accessibility, a voting process. Language is a big part of it. And we also collaborate with the State Language Accessibility Advisory Committee, the LAC, as well as with the Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee. So all of those platforms are there to integrate the multifaceted work that elections administrators have to deal with. And but I do always look at I'm trying to always look for a silver lining in all of this, and it just gives us a great opportunity right now with to be able to organize, to be able to collaborate, and to be able to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to have their ballot and cast it and understand the process. And as we move through this pandemic together, we can address these issues and make sure that the trusted voices that I know are in this audience right now have the right information, have the right resources and connections with the elections officials, because we cannot do it without the advocates and all the organizations. We need the trusted voices with the right message. So I appreciate this opportunity. And I want to also highlight that this particular mandate, this particular situation that we have right now of everyone getting a vote by mail ballot, we could turn it into, for the limited English proficiency voters, it could give them maybe for the first time an opportunity to actually see their ballot and understand that they don't have to vote on everything to be able to participate, and that they could actually have more time maybe to examine and to be able to reach out for assistance if that is needed, from the election officials, from the particular county. So I want to encourage everyone to think about how we can make this work, because we're all in this together, and we're all going to have to move through it for this November. But I think I look forward to it, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, Erin. So our panel is going to use a number of questions from me to our panelists to really get into the meat of language access and our challenges around language access in lieu of slides. Before I go there, I want to give you some stats to really exemplify the scope of our challenge. So in California, we have roughly 15 million Latinos. We have roughly 6 million Asian Americans. In both communities, roughly 3 out of 4 say that on the census, they speak a language other than English at home, and roughly 1 in 3 identify as limited English proficient. Now, that's not voters, that's not citizens, that's all residents, but it gives you a sense of how large our Latino and Asian American communities are in California, and they don't even represent the full extent, of course, of our limited English-speaking immigrant communities and our limited English-speaking immigrant voters. So question number 1, James Schwab mentioned in his remarks earlier that people who have served as longtime poll workers are indicating to elections officials that they're not interested in serving in November. If it's going to be difficult to recruit poll workers, it's going to be really difficult to recruit bilingual poll workers. So what are some ideas and best practices around recruiting bilingual poll workers, given the challenges posed by COVID? I'll hand it over to Julia for her answer.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so this will be a challenge, but a lot of the best practices that have applied in the past to how to recruit bilingual poll workers will apply again here. And in some ways will maybe dovetail nicely with the fact that we have a bunch of outreach work to do about the November election regardless. So one of the key things is to be collaborating with community groups on the ground to find folks who have the language skills who can be recruited to be poll workers. So that could be a civic engagement group, but it could also be something like a church or folks who assemble around a community center or other group that's not directly focused on civic engagement. Another idea is to collaborate with high schools to try to reach diverse families and to get the next generation of poll workers in the pipeline. And then also relying on partners like us who can maybe help connect an elections office with some organizations that they might not know of or be in touch with, but who would have connections to communities that have needed language skills. And then as there is advertising and education going out about the transition to the new election system generally, bringing in the need for poll workers throughout that. We see this in the census space where we talk about census is coming, but then we also say, and they need workers. So it's the messaging is doing two roles. It's helping you with your recruitment, but it's also helping you get out the core message to everyone. And then additionally, a few things to make the role of being a bilingual poll worker more appealing to people. So providing a stipend for folks who have the language ability to show that you value that they're bringing that to the poll worker role. Additionally, considering a travel stipend. So if folks need to work at a polling place or vote center that's outside of their neighborhood, they don't feel burdened getting there. And that will allow counties to spread out their bilingual poll workers as needed. And then finally, to uplift the safety best practices that are going to be put into place. So everyone in this group has been doing all this great thinking, all these elections offices have been doing great thinking about how to recruit or how to safely run elections, and the recruiting needs to explain that that is part of the process so people don't feel like it's dangerous to be a poll worker.
Thanks, Julia. Rosalind, do you want to add?
The only thing I would add is that I think in this new public health environment, the people who are closest and have the cultural competence and the language skills to work with language minority communities, we have a whole group of new people because of the public health environment. And, we really encourage both community organization and election officials to look for new partners. Maybe it's in the health community, who could be people who would be a source for bilingual poll workers. In addition to letting potential poll workers know about, how the in-person environments will be safe, I think it's also good, this is always done, but even more so now, to be very open about, look, you're going to get training, okay? You're not only going to get compensation, but you're going to be trained. The training will, of course, be adjusted to our new environment. So all of these things can also help when we're reaching out to and recruiting poll workers with a cultural competency and the skills that are needed. Thank you.
And we have one comment in the audience Q&A. We're going to get to audience Q&A after we sort of we finish with our facilitated panelist Q&A. But we have one comment in the Q&A that someone could reach out to social studies classes because it would be a good civics lesson for students. And that's a great idea. It's in the case that many counties already have a high school poll worker program, and they're in collaboration with their school districts. But if you have connections to your local schools and could facilitate student poll workers, I'm sure your county elections office would love to know about that and appreciate your assistance. Okay, we're going to move to our second question. What are the best practices around translation of elections material. Rosalind?
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. So, you know, when Jonathan first talked about the requirements to provide language assistance, particularly the federal requirements, they cover pretty much everything a jurisdiction does when it touches voters, whether it's voting and registration informational materials, whether it's instructions at the polling place, whether it's signage, whether it's mailings, whether it's websites. So first of all, again, and many election officials are doing this already, but it's also particularly important when we're going to have vote by mail be probably a much larger part of the work that election officials are doing, is really taking a good inventory and assessment and checklist. And I know election administrators are great at checklists. So making sure there's a good inventory of everything that needs to be translated. In addition, making sure that people have very easy, accessible information about how to get in language materials. So that means, you know, a mailing to people about how to request in-language materials. Think about how websites are set up. You know, if you have a website, you only have a little tiny thing on the top of the website that tells people how they can convert it to another language. That's just not easy to find. You know, whatever the home page is for election information really needs to be able to direct people to get those translated materials from the website as easily as possible. And similarly, for those people who do vote in person, you know, being able to clearly see immediately who at the site they can go to get language assistance and translated materials is very important as well. With respect to who does the translating, you know, many jurisdictions use commercial vendors. They use sometimes court interpreters, and those services do have a fairly decent quality of translation for materials. But you know, we strongly encourage, and we're happy to work with election officials on really bringing in other voices to look at and review translated materials. So for example, you know, there may be in a bilingual coordinator or the person who's in charge of language assistance practices at the jurisdiction itself who should be looking at those materials. Ideally, having a feedback from community groups, because idioms are so different, dialects are so different. You know, the more sets of eyes you can get to look at materials and provide feedback better, and providing community partners with enough lead time. You know, occasionally I think community groups are familiar with a situation where they've been said, you know what, you have 2 days to look this over, please give us feedback. You know, it doesn't usually happen that way, but again, the more lead time and the more, you know, input that can be obtained on translated materials, the better. You know, Google Translate, not a good idea. It just, you know, no website should just be translated by Google Translate. I think people, if you've ever used it for anything not election related, you see that it does not work particularly well, and even more so because of the specialized terms that are used in elections. Finally, I would just say that start off having things written. You know, when you look at the English language, that's a starting point. It should be plain language. It should be accessible language. So if your starting point is plain language materials in English, it will make translating into accessible language much easier. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalind. Okay, we're going to move to our next question. So a question for Aaron. How are elections officials thinking about making these new restructured voting sites accessible to language minority communities, both in terms of their location in the community and how you structure the services that are available inside them?
Thank you, Jonathan. So there's a number of things that we have to consider as we administer elections. And obviously one of the biggest ones is locations and finding the locations. Our previous panelists already touched on that, what a challenging task that's going to be. But in the way that we're handling it too is looking at the fact that if everyone who's registered up to now, gets a vote by mail ballot at home, then their return of their ballot could be at any of these locations because they're not limited to a specific traditional polling place. So there's that aspect that we also need to consider. But in terms of in-person voting experiences, we want to make sure that they are still in the areas where we see, we have maps, for example, our office where we're looking, I would call them heat maps, we're looking at where the higher concentration of in-person voting is happening, because that's where we wanted to continue to provide them. And that way, the limited resources that we might have, we might be able to strategize better as to where to place them. We've never had a surplus, I think, across the whole state of California of bilingual poll workers. So that is even more important, to know where do we place the bilingual poll workers that or volunteers that we get from the various areas. And like to make the point, some of them might need to be transported or be asked to volunteer in an area that is not necessarily where they live. But being very familiar with our communities and what our trends of voting in-person opportunities are very, very important. The locations, the challenges with the locations is making sure that they meet accessibility guidelines, but they're also have the space constraints, because we want to keep our workers as well safe, as well as our voters. So the drop-off locations, a lot of counties are providing much more locations where people can just drop off their voted ballot ahead of time. We don't need postage, like Courtney mentioned in the previous panel. We are the type of services that we will continue to do, and we want to emphasize with all the service organizations and advocates is our voter information guide. That has a lot of information, very specific to the voter, very specific to their precinct, and with all the other alternate services that we might have. Remote accessible vote by mail is a feature that it was spoken about in the previous panel as well, that can address the issues of accessibility in a broader sense, including language. So, and we can have our equipment at the in-person locations programmed to be able to have an official ballot for a person in the language that they need. So there are a lot of different things, but we're all taking all of this into consideration with this new challenges and limitations that we might have. So although the locations may be fewer, perhaps because of logistics restrictions, we want them to be efficient, and we want them to be accessible and visible to voters. So that it's some of the work. And like I said, it's just really knowing our communities and knowing where our voters are and what the tendencies and preferences, including the I voted sticker that we talked about, in the other previous drive-through locations. I know some counties are talking about drop-off locations. We have existing curbside voting that's been in place, for a traditional polling place or for anybody that needs assistance. So maybe expanding a little bit of that definition of curbside, either voting or ballot return. So those are just opportunities for people to still be able to see someone physically and ask their question, but make it more prominent what the information, phone numbers are for our communities and what our language services, expanding on that. So that's what I have right now.
Thanks, Erin. So we have enough time for one more question from me, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please type them to the Q&A, and I'll track them for our panelists. Last question from me. So in November of 2020, as I mentioned earlier, millions of voters who typically use the polling place and the language accessibility that's available in the polling place are going to be moving to vote by mail. Now, some of them, of course, will continue to vote in person, but a lot of them will vote by mail for the first time. That means we lose that moment when they walk to the table at the front of the polling place and they're asked by a poll worker what language they'd like to vote in. How do we replace that interaction where, you know, the voter has been given a couple opportunities, not a ton, but a couple opportunities to identify their language preference for their county elections office in advance of election day. But for a lot of voters, it is that interaction with the poll worker in which they're asked what ballot they want, what language they want their ballot in. That's the last line of defense to make sure that a voter gets language assistance. And for lots of voters, we're losing that. So a question for you, Julia. How do we replace that experience and find out people's language preference in a predominantly vote by mail environment?
Yeah, that's a great question and going to be a challenge, but we have a few ideas for how we can make sure we know that a voter has a language preference before we get to November so that folks can get by mail the assistance that they need. One of the benefits of doing that is it means we can possibly see fewer people trying to go vote in person. So doing the investment upfront to update language preferences will help make sure voters can get their assistance in some cases without needing to go to the polls. So one way to do that would be to send a mailer to all voters advertising the availability of language assistance and providing an easy way to update that information. So that can be a returnable postcard, an in-language hotline or website. The more options probably the better in terms of making it easy for people to say, yes, I do want a ballot that is in my language under Section 203, or I do want you to send me a facsimile that I can refer to for my language under Section 14201. So using mail to advertise and solicit response. Also thinking about, if needed, doing targeted mailers where we look at census data on where LEP communities are concentrated and sending mailers to those areas. And then also updating our online voter registration system so that when people register to vote, they have a chance to say if they have a language preference. And so that should include all Section 14201 languages as well as Section 203, just so that we have that record on file. And if someone ends up in a county where that's a covered language, we'll already know that they have that language need and we'll be able to serve them going forward. So those are things we can do for November that also benefit us all long-term by expanding our language access for future elections too.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, I'm gonna move to the question and answer section from the audience. I'm gonna start with one question from Catherine Miller. Is it appropriate to promote using family members to help non-English speaking relatives with their ballots when possible? The answer, of course, is yes. Which of our panelists would like to take that? Rosalind, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. In fact, we know that family members are often the most persuasive messengers in terms of encouraging people to vote and encouraging people to participate. And certainly our research with members of the Latino community has shown, you know, as we joke, if you want a family member to vote, make sure his or her mother tells him or her to do so. It is perfectly appropriate, you know, assuming there isn't undue pressure. You know, that's going to be family dynamics. But yes, family members can indeed help with translation, or also can help direct people to where they can get translated materials and other information.
And under California law, up to a voter can bring up to 2 people to assist them in voting in a polling place, so long as those people do not represent the voter's employer or the voter's union. So it is it is not just helpful, as Rosalind indicated, it's completely and totally legal. Okay, I want to move to another question. Maybe a question from Aaron, perhaps, representing elections officials. Are there spoken word translations of ballots that can help people who are low literacy or members of the blind community?
Yes, so there are ballot marking devices that we have at every polling place location or early vote site or vote center, satellite offices, you know, county offices that have the audio version of what is on their ballot, and it has it's meant for accessibility, and like I said, in the broader sense, not only limited to a physical or disability that we traditionally think of. So someone with limited English, they could listen to their to the translation of their actual ballot, rewind it, advance it, and so forth. Also, the remote accessible vote by mail option could be something that is available for not only a person who does a lot of their reading, via different software on their particular computer at home, because they can actually read it and use whatever programs that they have, for translating it or for accessibility issues. So that is a way that they can actually be able to read and have sound or a spoken word to it. Actually, both ways, accessible both by mail, remote, or at the ballot marking device.
And another question for Erin. Erin, what are some of the most successful techniques you've seen for recruiting bilingual poll workers?
Definitely word of mouth, and the people who are already engaged in their communities, the people that are volunteering, from doing the food bank to, the community clinics. That's where you see it, because we see that they are responding to an immediate need in their neighborhoods and in the communities they're serving. Another location where we've had some level of success is at the citizenship ceremonies. Not all the time, because not everyone who is a naturalized citizen necessarily has, is proficient, and to the extent that they need in another language, but we do have some success with that. We also recruit a number of our colleague, county and state workers, because they, especially in the health services department, where they tend to do a lot of translation, but definitely the community-based organizations or people who are already engaged and things like that, and word of mouth. Once you do it with one time, you bring a friend, it's like the personal reference. They take a lot of pride. A lot of our workers have been doing this for many, many years. And so that's usually the best approach. Is like, I know someone who can help, and many times their own voters, when they've experienced certain challenges and they're troubleshooting, then they say, you know what, I think I could help. So definitely word of mouth and personal reference.
So if any of our audience today wants to serve as a poll worker or can act as a personal reference and point friends and family members to their county elections official, go for it. We have a question from Charles Kim, who notes that sometimes there are real serious challenges with the quality of translation, and notes a couple ideas for how to improve them. And I want to just throw them out to the panel so they can react. One is using a review board of some kind, community member review board, to review translation and modification and presumably to get input on language assistance. Let's put a pin in that for perhaps Rosalind or Erin to answer, because I think the lack could be sort of an idea we're sharing. And then also using consistent terminology across counties and using the Secretary of State as a place where you translate translate terms once, create an elections glossary, and then all counties use those consistent translated terms. Does anyone want to react to those?
I think many of those ideas are consistent with what we've been talking about. If you want to have some at the county level, a formal advisory committee is very helpful to provide that kind of input, and we think advisory committees are going to be looking for new and different ways to meet. But certainly having a formal committee at the county level, where you get kind of the different perspectives from different language communities is helpful. Now, in terms of the glossary, the Election Assistance Commission, the federal agency that provides support and technical assistance for elections, has indeed come up with a glossary of election terms in many languages already. And the extent to whether that's something the Secretary of State should adopt or should look at is certainly something that's possible, but it's already out there, available for election officials who may want to use it.
I'll add a little bit, Jonathan. So I am a member of the Languages Advisory Committee too at the state level, and that's something that we're considering using, creating a glossary of suggested terms, because the EAC's terminology, like you mentioned, Russell, tends to be a little bit more East Coast driven. So it's something that we need to be mindful of, that even within California, we have different dialects and different preferences, we know. So that's something to keep in mind as you are trying to make the translations the most usable, for your voters. That's why I keep emphasizing we have to know who our voters are. And one other thing is that there are review periods for a lot of the different documents that come out of that, what's going to be on the ballot. So it's something that maybe we can emphasize, to all these participants, that to take note as to when all of this reviewing steps for the ballot itself, and candidate statements, all of that is all under public review. So there are many, many opportunities in addition to once things are translated, because I know that is a very important thing. So look out on the Secretary of State's website. The dates will be listed as to when documents come out and when the review periods are for various aspects of the election, because we start working on the ballot layout months in advance, and so we need to make sure. But so there are opportunities for people to have input and definitely, be part of advisory committees and being poll workers. That's your great opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. So, Charles, great suggestions in the chat. Reach out to your county elections office to see if they have a language advisory committee, and maybe seek out the state language access advisory committee. I want to thank everyone for hanging in with us towards the end of the day here for this critically important panel. As I mentioned at the beginning, California has the unique challenge of having to build the nation's first truly multilingual democracy if it's going to build an inclusive and equitable democracy. And so as we adjust to COVID realities and tackle those challenges, we have to make sure that language access is always part of the equation. So thanks for your time. Thanks to my panelists today for doing a fabulous job. And with that, I will hand it back over to Astrid and our organizers.
Thanks, John.